Right, I suspect we'll have a few more joiners in due course, but I suggest we kick off slightly earlier. A very good afternoon to you all, and welcome to this webinar, which is titled Agentic AI, Exploring the Next Frontier in Artificial Intelligence. I'm Usman Ikhlaq, Program Manager for Artificial Intelligence at techUK, and I'll be chairing today's discussion. techUK, as many of you will know, is the UK's technology trade association with over 1,000 members, the majority of whom are startups and SMEs, but also a number of large organizations in membership too. Before we kick off, I do want to provide some context in terms of what we're looking for in this session, but also the AI Leader Series. This is a new event series where we seek to bring together some of the brightest minds in artificial intelligence to explore cutting-edge developments, trends, and really to talk about the transformative potential of AI on the UK's economy and society. And I think thought leadership is especially current in policy terms, given the government's recent ambitions to boost the UK's AI sector to in turn boost economic growth. So before we kick off, just a few house rules. I did flag a few of these into the chat, but if you are not a panelist, please ensure that your microphones and cameras are turned off to ensure for a good discussion without disturbance, and please do use the chat function for any questions, and we'll certainly field some questions at the end of this session. I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by a stellar panel, which includes Andrew Allen from Microsoft, Nell Watson from the European Responsible AI Office, Sarwar Khan from Salesforce, and James Duez from Rainbird. And I may just pause for a second to allow each of them to briefly introduce themselves. Andrew, shall we kick off with you?
Thanks, Usman. Thank you very much, everybody. It's great to be here. Andrew Allen from Microsoft. So I'm a Chief Digital Technology Officer for Government, working across public sector engagement, particularly off the back of the current announcements from government, working very closely to understand how AI can help the public sector as a whole. Thanks, Usman.
Thanks, Andrew. And we'll turn to Nell Watson next. We may come back to Nell. Sarwar, should we go to you next?
Hi everyone. My name is Sarwar Khan. I lead government affairs for Salesforce in the UK and Ireland. For those that don't know Salesforce, we are a enterprise software company that specializes in customer relationship management and in enterprise AI. Surprise, surprise. My day job is managing, tracking, building our relationships with government, and I suppose my interest here is, helping government to understand the developments in the sort of agentic AI space, being able to inform their policy making process in this regard, and also helping the company navigate through the legislative environment.
Brilliant, thank you, and we will go to James next.
Hi everybody, I'm James Duez. I'm CEO and co-founder of Rainbird. My background, I originally worked in regulatory risk and compliance for 15 years, so very focused on how we make decisions that absolutely have to be right. And I spent 20 years now, nearly 20 years, working in explainable and trusted AI, so very focused on how we apply automation and AI to high stakes applications where it really matters. Rainbird, my company, our role is, we help organizations create AI agents that are precise, consistent, and explainable, which is the things we all would like our AI to be, but are not synonymous with this latest wave of generative and agentic technology.
Brilliant, thank you, James. Nell, would you like to introduce yourself? Just checking if you're on the call.
I am indeed, yes. I'm Nell Watson. I have long had a strong interest in both AI ethics and AI safety, creating a range of different standards and certifications in that area. And agentic AI really takes us out of the pure AI ethics realm and really into AI safety for the first time. These systems are operating at arm's length, and we're sending them off on missions. And that means that for the first time, we really have to deal with value and goal alignment as well. And that's something that's tricky, especially for ordinary, everyday members of the public. So there's a lot of education to be done about agentic AI, how it's different, and how it's changing everything.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nell, and thank you all. We'll certainly make for an insightful discussion. And as I mentioned from the outset, there will be an opportunity for questions at the end, so do pop them into the chat. We'll kick off and get straight into it. I think it goes without saying that AI is evolving rapidly. I think that's probably the understatement of the year and probably the century. And in some ways, it's starting to feel like we're in a sort of sci-fi series. I think we started with predictive AI, which analysed data and used machine learning for forecasts. But then we had the sort of generative AI boom. And we could say we've arrived at that next destination, which is agentic AI, where not only can outputs be generated, but also conversation and autonomously actions and reactions stemming from that. So I suppose my question to the panel is, we're hearing a lot about agentic AI through discussions. It's certainly all over LinkedIn. It's what led to, I think, 120 people dialing into this session today. But how can we make sense of agentic AI? What does it mean to you, and how would you define it? So I might go to you first, if that's okay. I think you've got a few points to make, including some policy context with respect to the Opportunities Action Plan, but also the AI Readiness Index, which I believe Salesforce put out. So I'll hand over to you, and looking forward to hearing more.
Absolutely. Thank you. For me, I think the simplest definition is AI that agentic AI is one that performs tasks autonomously. That is vastly different to the previous waves of AI we've seen. So starting with the first wave of predictive AI, secondly, moving on to generative AI, and now we're into the current third wave of AI, which is agentic. And for example, an agentic AI can now book me a holiday based on my needs or preferences, whereas a generative AI would simply give me a list of recommendations and for me to take away and act out on. And I think the key difference there is that agentic AI has reasoning capability, so that an agent it acts on its own autonomously. It makes decisions in real time in order to deliver on that specific goal or task that you might set it, and it's able to adapt as well. So it only gets better by learning from the environment and the context in which it operates in. And it's it contrasts to things like chatbots and LLMs, which generally require constant sort of input prompts from in order to generate outputs for action, which is quite time consuming, understandably. So I think the exciting thing for agentic AI is that it can be deployed pretty quickly, and it can be integrated into the flow of work, giving sort of almost immediate value and benefit for the users. I'm happy to talk to sort of some of the opportunities that we're seeing very briefly. I think for Salesforce, it clearly is a very exciting time. I think we see huge potential. For us as a company, I mean, we've already sort of kind of are starting to or are going through quite a significant transformation to sort of get to grips with this tool and how it can transform our business, so that not only do we perform better, but we can also serve our customers more effectively. So one example I'll give you is our Salesforce help website, which receives over 60 million visits annually from customers who are needing assistance in one way or another. And around 2 million of those visits are handled by employees directly, needing to resolve issues with the service. But since we've introduced Agentforce, over 85% of those inquiries have now been resolved by an agent, with a much smaller handoff to employees. So in cases which are very complex or need a lot more human inputs, they can be handled quickly and more effectively by an employee, whereas the majority of cases have been resolved by an agent. And that's a better outcome, I think, for all, not just for the business, but also for the customer who's needing that information to get a resolution to their issues. And I would say it's not just about efficiency, making savings, doing more for less. It's also, I think, really, it's redefining how businesses are interacting with their customers and being able to improve that experience. And just briefly, finally, I think you mentioned the opportunities around the government's recent AI Opportunities Action Plan. I think that's a really positive step It's a clear roadmap that sets out how the UK will boost AI adoption, but also make the UK a leader in terms of attracting investment, talent, and developing that ecosystem where AI could really flourish and be successful. And I think that there is a danger that we can over talk it and believe the hype, but I would say certainly from my experience and the work that we're doing in the business that we're seeing quite a lot of appetite and demand for how this tool can be used to address some very real current challenges, whether that's constraints on finances or even sort of constraints on labor.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sarwar. Lots to unpack there. Not sure where to start, but I completely agree on the point of how agentic AI adoption can improve the quality of services provided. I think that's something which is something which needs to be hammered home on many occasions. It's not just a case of deploying these tools for the sake of profit maximization and so on, but also ensuring that there is that sort of customer experience angle to it as well. So thank you for touching on that. Nell, I may go to you next. I think you've put out a lot of thought leadership on this, and I think I recently read your article on preparing for a new wave of agentic AI. So I'll hand over to you, and keen to hear more.
Thank you. In many ways, agentic AI can be thought of as adding cortices to a model. Our brains, for example, have multiple cortices within them. Our visual cortex helps us to see. The fusiform gyrus helps us to recognize faces. And of course, the prefrontal cortex helps us to strategize. But with generative, we've basically had one sort of blob without any sort of specialization built into it. That's about to change. With agentic, we are able to add what's called programmatic scaffolding to help models to specialize parts of their thinking. We can help them to think in a more logical and more coherent manner. We can give them short and long-term memory to increase their context of the material that they're working with. And this means that these systems can think in a much more coherent manner. They can plot, for example, 200 steps of an action prior to executing it. And that is what is enabling these agentic capabilities, which are otherwise latent. They're sort of hidden within the model, and we can actually tease them out and turn our existing generative models into highly scalable agentic platforms, which are able to read a room, look at a situation, and create a very sophisticated plan of action and response. This is miles away from simply requesting that something proofread a document or generate a picture. These systems are capable of truly independent action, and that's very exciting, greatly increases our capabilities, but of course also greatly increases the potential for things to go wrong.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nell. Quite an interesting take on that. James, I'll turn to you next, if that's okay. I think Rainbird has done a number of work in this space, and I think you've developed a few agents yourself. So keen to learn more.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think maybe I'm going to take a bit of a step back. I mean, the AI world is not particularly good at naming things. And we have to remember that even the term AI describes a very broad spectrum of different technologies that come and go with the seasons. And agentic actually isn't a new term. I mean, I have in the past reached off back behind me and pulled a textbook from the 1990s that talks about agentic AI. So here it is again, come back into fashion. And I think again, it's becoming a fairly broad label that means sort of different flavors of agentic AI or AI agents, ranging from some things that are reasonably basic, but having some sort of agency to take action, to more complex multi-step workflows, to fully fledged AI assistants. I think the key idea here is autonomy. I mean, agentic AI can ultimately is being charged with taking some sort of action with limited human intervention. So, it's goal oriented. It's typically designed to achieve a specific objective. It's adaptive. It's can learn from interactions and refine its approach. And it's autonomous in that it's capable of making some independent decisions about how it organizes itself. And these are very distinct from using large language models or generative AI on its own. And here's maybe an analogy. LLMs ultimately, these large language models that power in sequence these agentic workflows on their own, they operate a bit like somebody trying to write a book without the benefit of having a backspace key. They are ultimately streaming out predictive content in one continuous stream. And there's no reasoning that's going on inside an LLM, not in the way that we really would consider a reasonable definition of this term reasoning. And you can tell this because if you ask a large language model a simple question or a complex question or even an impossible question, the amount of compute it will expend giving you an answer, generating an answer is the same. That's sort of not the way the real world works. If it's a complicated problem, we tend to have to put more effort in to work that problem. So agentic AI, can really consist of individual agents, each perhaps tasked with various various tasks, various micro tasks, talking to and challenging each other in a process that itself is orchestrated in a sort of a predictive way. But I think it's important that we reflect carefully on some of the words that we're using, words like reasoning and thinking, because reasoning itself is being somewhat redefined to suit some of these definitions. We have to remember that these models are trying to simulate being logical, but without the benefit of actually being logical or causal. But there's no doubt that there's huge value to be had here. But putting a series of LLMs together, orchestrated by another LLM to try and build a bigger process, that's a powerful capability. But taking lots of little imprecise technologies and putting them together doesn't make them precise. And I think we have to remind ourselves of the nature of what these technologies are and how we're stitching them together.
I completely agree, and I think there's certainly a long list of terms to sort of think about, and various definitions with respect to AI itself. And I think trying to agree on what AI is has been quite a challenge. So thank you, thanks for that. Andrew, I'll turn to you next. I think you've got some thoughts about how to actually potentially do that, differentiating agentic AI from other tools. So I'll hand over to you.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that you've heard an awful lot, really, of perspectives around agency. I think I like James's perspective in that we're applying terms in lots of different ways and can mean many different things, and it's trying to help everyone on this call understand how do we differentiate agents from sort of how we've described artificial intelligence or Gen AI in the past. And maybe if I was to surmise it in a slightly different lens again, maybe recapping some of the points we've already heard. But the reason why we call these agents as agents is because they have agency, i.e. ultimately they will have the ability to make autonomous decisions within guardrails. But essentially the power that's then applied to them is the ability for them to sense an environment. So within the agents or within that agency process, it has the ability to sense the environment, whether that's simply seeing text that's coming in through a conversation. But if you take it forward into what you're seeing coming out of sort of some of the cutting edge technology when we move into robotics and other areas, this idea where we're taking multimodal inputs and it's taking all that context into its sort of thought process, or its process, if you like, of how it's operating. And at the same time, the other aspect of it has this ability to then sort of optimize for the solution they're given. So we're quite used to talking to a chatbot at the moment, and the context of that conversation is very reflective of how we choose to interact with it. Now we can give it an outcome and it will go away, optimize a solution to deliver that outcome and come back with you for a result. And at the moment, we're in this stage where we've got solutions that are very early in maturity in terms of how autonomous or entirely not autonomous it is, all the way through to experimentation to what this autonomy may look like in the future. And the biggest question we have for ourselves is, how do we, as individuals in our roles, in our businesses, in our lives, start to understand how to adapt and use this technology? Because if you lift the lid on this whole industry, it's moving along at 1,000 miles an hour under the hood. And I think we're trying to determine at what point do we start to see the value delivered inside our organization that makes sense. And it really does come back to skills of how we're interacting. I think the shockwave of when ChatGPT first came out as an experiment 2 years ago, we've sort of seen a light of, oh, these things appear to be quite cognitively capable, but they are very reflective. And so we still have to define the right guardrails to what these jobs will do, work out how we adapt to work with them in the context of our work, and then we can see how that will optimize the way of working within our organization. And ultimately, I think it will force us to work in a higher level of capability, because there will be activities we can hand off to these agents, these AI systems that can carry these things out on our behalf. Probably the most simple example I can give you, which is probably the forefront, is in the coding space. You've seen lots of different organizations put out sort of modern code generation tools, and they use the word agent because I can describe what application I want built with some loose description of, I need a professional looking website that has a modern design. And the agent decides to build a project plan and then go and develop the code for each part of that project plan. And it will come back and validate, have I met the requirements of your design? Here's the finished website. And that's probably in one area where we're seeing probably the most traction, because codifying, understanding computer language is being quite a successful task with how we've sort of optimized the use of language models.
Thanks, Andrew. Lots to unpack there as well, and completely agree with all your points. We're on time, which is good. So I think we'll delve into more of those sort of opportunities with respect to agentic AI. And so I think, as was touched on just now, evolving very fast, and sort of keen to understand what are the biggest opportunities that it could bring, and are there any emerging trends the panel feel we should, keep an eye on. Nell, I might go to you first, if that's okay. I think you've got some thoughts with respect to test bedding and some other ideas, so I'll hand over to you.
Absolutely. Agentic AI is really shaking up tasks such as event planning, logistics, even systematic literature reviews. But where we're going next is entirely agentic teams, which work amongst themselves and even split into multiple departments. So you have a team of agents working on design or engineering. You have another team working on quality assurance, another team working on marketing, and they themselves are able to create a product, whether that's a video game or a movie script. We are at the dawn of that age, and we can kind of see where this is going in the next 3 to 5 years. This will evolve into agentic corporations, which have some humans at the edges, especially doing the sort of meet and greet kind of work, but that most of the actual thinking and planning of these systems will be done using automated means. Now, these models and the corporations built around them will not require salaries, they won't require offices. And so whilst they may lack some of the capabilities of human firms, they will be radically disruptive in many domains. And as they improve in their capabilities, we can expect these agentic-driven corporations to start to edge out some of the incumbent orgs. Agentic models also give us incredible new ways of understanding social dynamics. We can spawn hundreds or millions of agents which operate with each other, simulating the ways in which human beings find what they're good at, choose a task, and indeed may even collaborate to create new rules or laws. This gives us an incredible test bed for understanding how policies may potentially backfire through a Cobra effect, or indeed we can A/B test policies in a much more ethical manner than one would be done in real life. Something else which is important to remember about agents is that humans are limited by Dunbar's number, which says that beyond about 150 people, it becomes really difficult to coordinate. You have to create all kinds of rules and scaffolds and policies to do so. Agents don't seem to have that problem, and so they can coordinate on scales that are far beyond that which human beings can do. And this also potentially creates strange emergent effects when many different agents come together. Sometimes they can go off in strange directions. So we should be mindful of how we are engaging, particularly with agent swarms.
Some interesting thoughts, and I think there have been many discussions and events, and I think numerous thought leadership pieces about the actual convergence of technologies. And I think with agentic AI, that's certainly one area of importance. And I think we're all watching to see what would happen. So thank you for that, Nell. Andrew, I might turn to you next. I know you touched on a few sort of things in your opening statement in the introduction, but sort of keen to learn more about adaptability, efficiency, and personalization, along with some other thoughts as well. So I'll hand over and keen to hear more.
So I think that some of the biggest areas we're seeing impact at the moment is that workflow transformation as individuals within organizations. And I think it's necessitating a need for us to reflect on how we carry out those knowledge work processes now going forward. If you think back similar to when PCs were first introduced, email, spreadsheets, mobile phones, the iPhone, all of this is now taken as de facto baseline and normal. It's the first time it came into the scene, we had to think about how we would transform the way we work. And now we're at this point where the workflows that we carry out day to day, we need to think very differently in terms of how we interact with our teams and our colleagues, but leveraging AI in a way that we can think with AI to support our process sort of rationalization and take us up to a different level of engagement with the way we interact with the systems. As I said, we're still on a very much journey of what does an agent mean? It spans a very broad set of capability. If we think far left to the absolute simplest form, we're talking about instructions where we're giving it to something and it's going away and giving us some responses which may be more honed down to a specific area. So for example, if I was working in policy and I needed quick access to the latest relevant information in my particular field, I could have an agent that has access to a corpus of information that's very specialized to my particular area, but can benefit from the general sort of capability of the language model itself. Then I can take it a step on. Maybe it's into a more retrieval based, where it's grounding information more from some of my corporate information systems, and it's drawing information from different sources, maybe building some reports, building some outputs on my behalf to take a level of effort away from myself, and it's automatic report generation. When I start to give it a task, so the example I gave around sort of developer examples, where I give it a high level statement, a desired outcome. And so in my workflow, where I think about it's very automated and repeatable within my organization, how can I now replace those with agents that I have control, jurisdiction, understand the guardrails, and I'm still the person that's augmenting the process along the journey, but it's carrying out a large amount of heavy lifting. And then that real autonomous end state is still very much a state of flux where we think that will go. There is lots of work going in from a software engineering point of view for many organizations to understand what does an orchestration framework look like for those things. And I think some of the really interesting areas is like I touched on before, that sort of robotics area where we're now, instead of having to train a robotic a piece of robotic machinery thousands of times to do a very specific process, it's now learning from its environment, it's understanding from changes it makes and interactions it makes to improve the way that it can interact. So when we think about software and the context we are now, it's very much down about how we process optimize. And I think, again, it goes back to, we're calling this agents, but there's a whole lot of process optimization and automation that we're applying to leverage some of this newer capability and decision making that can exist within these agents. I think there's lots of examples out there to understand how do we think about it in the context of our organization. And I know we'll talk about it a little bit later, but it comes down to really is how do you understand the current state of play and experiment at a small scale, particularly in the context of your own organizations, because you won't find there's lots of repeatable solutions on the shelf. You've got to experiment and understand how it works in the context of your own individual business processes inside your organization.
Thanks, Andrew. I think that's a really fascinating point because I think there's, I feel like with AI adoption, use and deployment, there's this, I guess, fear of missing out. We've got to be seen to be doing something with AI, whether internally or I suppose developing models. And I think it sort of comes back to, I suppose, think big but act small. So identify one or two positive use cases. What are your business objectives? And then ultimately ensure there's action behind that. So I think it's a really sort of fascinating take on that. James, I might go to you next, if that's okay. I think you've got some thoughts about this and the extent to which there are opportunities which may be worth pursuing. So I'll hand over and keen to learn more.
Yeah, thank you. And I think everything that the other panel members have said, it makes a lot of sense, and I would agree with it. But I think any system and agentic systems are no different, are only going to stick if we can learn to trust the models, which in itself is something of a challenge. So I mean, we're certainly seeing many organizations who have one foot firmly in this agentic space at the moment, but one foot is also out. And I think that nobody is ready to take a human out of the loop in their experimentation, and that's absolutely the right thing for sure. Workflow transformation is definitely a focus. We're seeing lots of attempts to try and redesign complex sort of human intensive processes. But I think everybody who's experimenting with this technology needs to put constraints on what they're trying to do. And they really need to have a big think about the boundaries of the agency, the decision-making authority that they're prepared to give these systems. I think one of the things that I guess is useful to remember is because the majority of these agentic systems are based on large language models. LLMs are, you can take a series of agents and string them together, and what you end up with is something that's very good at filling the gaps from its own knowledge, which of course is trained on, to all intents and purposes, on the public internet. So it's very easy to build something that looks extremely impressive very quickly, but really does represent some significant issues around precision. So I think the promise of agentic AI is very exciting and interesting, but actually I would say whilst there are lots and lots of POCs, I think there are very few fully autonomous agentic AI systems that have made it into real world production. And the reason for that is because LLMs are not precise or deterministic, and simply stringing together multiple imprecise AI technologies so that they can talk to each other doesn't make a precise system. And in fact, in some areas, it compounds errors. So I think in terms of emerging trends and how to think about this and what's worth watching, three main things come to mind. Number one is, and again, it's maybe being a little bit technical, but a hybrid approach is what's working, right? You wouldn't use a large language model to do a mathematical calculation because LLMs aren't good at maths. You'd use a calculator, or you'd write some code that can do maths. Combining LLM-based agents, which are extremely good at creating content, with deterministic or symbolic AI or other methods in a hybrid approach is definitely where things are starting to get closer to production, where you can make some conscious decisions about what kind of guardrails you need and where you need to be precise. I think with greater autonomy comes greater accountability, and I think we can all expect much more scrutiny over agentic systems from regulators and other stakeholders, because it's implicit in these models that they have agency. And actually, I think the route that looks like it's proving most successful is being extremely domain specific. So whilst I think we listen to the narrative of some of the big frontier providers talking about artificial general intelligence, if you're a bank, for example, that's trying to make lending decisions, or you're an insurance company that's looking at trying to efficiently and accurately analyze claims, or you're making health decisions of consequence in high stakes environments, you don't need a general purpose AI. You want something that's extremely narrow, and you will trade that breadth of ability for precision in a narrow domain. So I think we're beginning to see highly specialized AI co-pilots, and of course, as was said earlier on, software development, legal AI, compliance AI are examples where you're beginning to see value for some of this spend in very narrow domains. But you're going to hear me continue to talk about things like precision and determination and trust, because this won't stick like many of the hype cycles that have come before it unless we can trust what these models are doing.
Thanks, James. I was wondering how long into the session it would take in order for trust to be mentioned. So thank you for that. I completely agree. I think there's been significant efforts underway both by government industry to ensure that that responsible AI is emphasised, development of assurance and principles and so on. And I think without that sort of emphasis, it's quite hard to really achieve that. And I think there has been this focus on human in the loop. And I guess there is a question about, the sort of autonomous nature of agentic AI. Will that sort of change things? And, will it set progress back? And we'll certainly touch on those in the risks section. So thank you for sharing that with us. A few comments in the chat, and we'll certainly put them to the panel at the end. Sarwar, I'll go to you next. Obviously keen to hear about the sort of current momentum. What are we seeing? I know that Salesforce had the AI Readiness Index, which was published some time ago. So yeah, keen to hear more on that and more. Yeah,
sure. Look, in terms of the biggest opportunities, I think they've been touched on already by the panel. We're seeing the sort of the biggest opportunities in two ways. One is the workflow processes and improving that, streamlining it so that, as an organization, we and our customers can work more efficiently and effectively and deliver on the services that they focus on. And secondly, I think what we're describing, how we see the sort of agentic AI, our particular agentic AI platform, Agentforce, we're describing it as a digital labor platform, which effectively, you could create a bank of agents, autonomous agents that work 24/7, round the clock. And if you're a global business, you're able to react and respond to inquiries, as you follow the sun, so that it really does help augment the work of the employee. The employees can focus on the kind of high value tasks, the objectives that, where they need to really focus on the complex, the stuff that needs human interaction. And I think, yes, it can be seen as a problematic statement, a digital labor platform, is that going to do away with jobs, workers' displacement, and so on? I think we're describing it as really augmenting. So, these agents are going to be set up with a really predefined, task and objective to help, enable you to do your job. It's not going to have an open-ended, sort of objective to do whatever it wants. Clearly, we need to have, robust guardrails in place. And I think Adam touched on that point, which is, having the human in the loop. So with agentic AI, you can have a human sort of set controls on what task it can do and what tasks it cannot do. And where it fails, it needs to hand off to humans to be able to make that, decision if it's a particularly a sensitive case or issue that it has to deal with. So I think those are the two ways that we see the agentic AI impacting and the opportunities it's creating in the UK landscape. You mentioned the AI Readiness Index. So we published a piece of research towards the end of last year, which effectively did a survey of our G7 economies across the world, and looked at how the UK was performing against those peers in terms of its approach and appetite to AI. And in a nutshell, it found that the UK was actually performing on average better than its G7 peers in terms of its appetite and willingness to invest. More than happy to share the report and findings with you after the call. But I think what that sort of presents to us is that the UK is actually, on most indicators, it's doing pretty well in terms of creating the sort of foundations, the pillars to both unlock the opportunities that AI can create, and also creating the sort of the ecosystem that attracts investment, that creates jobs, and provides opportunities for people.
Thanks, Sarwar. Some interesting comments, and I think it's quite interesting to read the action plan and learn that the UK has obviously the third largest AI sector, which is supported by additional publications and research, and I think really crucial to lay the foundations, and good to hear that the UK, has a sort of sound ecosystem in place, and really important to build the requisite infrastructures to then sort of change lives by embracing AI and securing our future with homegrown AI. So good to hear that too. I'm conscious of time, and I think there are a few questions in the chat as well. So I suggest we move on to the next segment of this session, which deals with the risks and challenges. And I know we've touched on this already, but we'd be keen to hear from the panel about what are the biggest challenges or pitfalls that I suppose businesses, organizations, people should be aware of when working with agentic AI. Nell, should we go to you first?
Sure. Yeah, well, when we are sending these systems off on a mission, it is extremely important that we align them to our goals and to our values, that we provide that kind of context for the agent to work within. We can't just provide a very laissez-faire mission. We need to very precisely define what we want in the way that we want it, and what we don't want, and how we don't want that task to be accomplished. Agents can tend to be quite lazy, especially if they have reinforcement mechanisms built into them. They will find expedient ways of solving problems, which may involve lying, or may involve cheating, or various forms of exploits or unexpected solutions for problems, which may technically answer the brief, but not be what we actually intended or wished for. We need to educate users urgently in how to work with these systems in a more safe manner. And indeed, ideally, I'm hoping and researching a little bit on trying to help AI systems to actually teach users, or to sort of mediate between the user and the model, to make sure that the user's mission is actually likely to be actioned in a safe manner, and to somewhat police the agentic planning of agents prior to them actually executing upon that. This is especially important because AI systems aren't just in cyberspace anymore. They are increasingly coming into embodied systems such as robots. Agentic planning processes enable robots to plan their next move. They can decide how to put away some groceries or how to navigate a complex environment, something which previous generations of AI would have been lost at. We are quite rapidly going to be working literally side by side with all kinds of very sophisticated robots that we can talk to and make requests of. And it's so important that we always are mindful of these emerging rapidly value and goal alignment issues.
Thanks, Nell. Completely agree. I think lots of questions in relation to what sort of convergence looks like as these agents do work together. I think a number of opportunities, but also a few concerns as well. So thank you for sharing those thoughts. Andrew, I'll go to you next, if that's okay. I know that you've got a few points to make with respect to concerns, possibly ethics as well. So I'll hand over and looking forward to hearing more.
Absolutely. So it's been said by my panelists already that there's a danger where we kind of look at a problem and assume this is the right answer that fixes everything. It's just another tool in the toolbox, and we have to be very cognizant of that fact that it has a very specialized capability and its nascent abilities in what we're kind of uncovering as we grow the size of the data models that sit behind it. But we have to be very cautious as well to understand, as already said, they're non-deterministic. So this use of our software up to this point, before these models became sort of front page news, is that when we built a software system, it would 100% of the time produce the same output 100% of the time. But now we're working with a different set of capabilities. And we have to really understand that. How does that fit inside our organizations and our existing domain knowledge and expertise that sits within our workers, within our employees, within the civil service, as an example. So I think paramount to all of this, and it's been stated already, is you have to have a strong governance and ethics framework within your organization that can establish and understand, if you're starting to look at AI projects to do some really impactful, high risk, high visibility, regulatory type activity, you have to understand, as you go through those experiments from day one, the implications, and try and preempt issues, preempt any kind of impacts that it might have in terms of how you engage with your customers, with your citizens, in terms of any service you might build. There's some good examples in public sector. GovUK has been experimenting with a GovUK chatbot, for example, and going through sort of a very slow, small scale rollout to experiment with interactions with that chatbot. And so that is a process you've got to go through and understand the implications and how it responds and how it works within the confines of your organization. At the same time, the individuals, the expertise you have in your human expertise in your organization, again, is paramount. And you have to start with augmentation, and you have to leverage that expertise in a interdisciplinary team of folk. So you'll have your domain experts, because they have the intrinsic knowledge to the domain of expertise you're trying to solve for. You have your data scientists who can understand how to put these systems together, whether it's leveraging generative AI or language models in the mix with existing ML or other bits of Lego in the kit bag, and those end users to understand the experience, to co-create those solutions. And it's iterating on the back of user feedback. Start small, experiment, and understand how it can be evolved inside your organization. The danger is certainly now it's kind of hitting consumerism. Every mobile phone has a version of some AI tool, some sort of AI chatbot. Very much same way that when iPhones first came out, it felt like the corporate systems that we use every day feel behind the curve, and there's an expectation that these have got some sort of magic capability. We do have to understand that these aren't incredibly capable machines. They can appear that because they're very reflective based on the human knowledge it's kind of evolved over when it's kind of looked at all the data that's been fed into the training. but we have to realize that we have to experiment with it. It's not an answer to everything. And so when you look at your infrastructure readiness, your data readiness across your organization, the same rules apply. You need good data, good organizational structure about how you've plumbed together all your internal systems, because that data that you feed into these systems is ultimately going to contribute massively to the quality of these outputs of these systems. So in some ways, there's a big crossover in terms of thinking about how you start to use AI in the very broad sense when we talk about generative, and also the concept of agents, because it's on the same journey path to understand how your organization can mature to experiment with and understand where it fits.
Thanks. Lot to unpack. I completely agree with everything you said, and including on experimentation. And I think there's often been a case of I suppose the cart going before the horse. I think there's a rush to almost try to solve issues and to use AI and to almost throw AI at that, including agentic AI. And I think there are a number of issues which can be resolved in businesses and in our private lives or in the public sector without the use of this. So it's about thinking about the smart application of that. And yeah, completely agree with all your points there. So I'll go to you next. I think you've got quite a few points to make. So yeah, happy to hand over, and yeah, keen to learn more.
Yeah, I would second, the points from Andrew and Nell that, prioritizing governance is essential. From our point of view, Salesforce's point of view, data privacy and security is probably the biggest, the sort of biggest risk, biggest challenge for customers and users of agentic AI. I mean, we operate in an enterprise space, so what I would say is that, we're already subject to quite high standards of privacy and security. That's not, that's already the norm, and it's not just because the law requires it, but because the customers that we serve, ranging from financial services down to public sector organizations, they demand it. Their organizations cannot operate without having that sort of assurance and sort of robust guardrails in place to protect that sensitive personal information. So I would say that that's absolutely key. In terms of how we as a company have operated, sort of approached this, we have a practice within the company, the Office of Ethical and Humane Use, which work very closely with our product and technology team, so that when we are designing our platforms, our products, that we instill ethical guidelines into the operation of those technologies. And that's something that we also make available for our customers, so that we have a responsibility. We have to ensure that when they are using our technology, that they are abiding by or following these kind of international standards and norms to make sure this works, effectively. It doesn't create problems down the line. So that's one of the ways I think we approach it. And similarly, I think from an architectural point of view, I'm not a technical, as you probably could have guessed by now, but one thing we've done is, we've set up our Agentforce Agentic AI platform in a way that ensures there is, it can access the data at source, and there is zero copy and zero data retention in the AI. So meaning that none of that personal information or sensitive information is retained by the AI, and that customer's data is secure. However, they're able to use an agentic platform to be able to, draw on that information to deliver the service the customer needs. So I think there are ways that companies and organizations can go about it. And the other point I think was already previously mentioned was, making sure humans are in the loop. So when you're with our Agentic AI platform, you can, the employee, the user can configure the agent to carry out specific tasks, and those are predefined, so it cannot run off and do something that's not intended. Of course, there will be unintended consequences, but as long as you're following those sort of ethical guidelines and putting those guardrails in place, you should be able to mitigate those risks.
Thanks, Sarwar. Again, a lot to unpack there, and yeah, good to, I think seriously a good point in relation to ensuring that ethical principles are embedded from design onwards, including from use and deployment. So thank you for sharing that. And yes, it also reinforces the need for human in the loop, which could be a separate discussion in some ways. And I think there may be a few more activities stemming from this webinar session. James, I'll move over to you if that's okay. I think you've got a few points to make, including on the need for guardrails, automation bias. I know you touched on some of this in the previous segment, but I'll hand over to you and yeah, keen to learn more.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I mean, I agree with what the other panelists have said. Sarwar's point about human in the loop remains absolutely essential. There are challenges with trust and accountability. They're technical challenges, they're ethical challenges, and as Andrew said, there's no magic in any of this, right? This is mathematics. But there are three, I've said it before, but there are three things people need to remember. None of this is precise. It's not deterministic. If you ask these models the same question 5 times, you'll get 5 slightly different answers. And as Andrew said, that isn't what we've been used to from software. And also, it's not inherently explainable. You can ask one of these models to explain its answer, and what it will do is predicts the answer. Then it predicts what an explanation might be. There's not necessarily logical. So, I'm a bit biased myself because I spent over a decade focusing on building companion technology that provides guardrailing and other architectures that deliver precision and determinism where needed. Because actually, if you look at the history of AI more generally, without trust, there's no lasting adoption, certainly not in areas where there are high stakes decisions. So I think it's right to ask questions like, who is responsible when this autonomous agent makes a bad decision? Because it will make a bad decision. These will continue to generate plausible but incorrect outputs. And I think there is a bit of a mindset, and you mentioned automation bias. Many think it's okay because, look, it's going to increase efficiency, and there's a very good argument there. I call that enhancing the user experience of experts, but it's not okay if you're focusing on giving a system agency or the ability to make decisions that in high stakes domains. So there's a reason why when we drive an autonomous vehicle, we keep our eyes on the road and our hands very, very close to the wheel, because you can't take your eyes off the road, and you certainly can't take your mind off the road. We're a long way away from that. And so that's why human in the loop remains essential. People need to be aware of automation bias because, and it is becoming better understood. People tend not to check. I mean, some research was done last year. People tend to not check. They get lazy. And as models improve, this actually becomes a bigger issue, leading to errors of even greater consequences. So, be aware that if the idea is we're going to build models that are going to do some of the work, but we're going to rely on humans to be the guardrail, just be aware there's some things pretty hardwired into our psychology in behavioral science that demonstrate that doesn't work on a lasting basis. So there are other production challenges. Many agentic systems work well in lab environments, but they do struggle in real world environments due to latency and cost. These multi-step workflows can actually be quite expensive and slow. There can be some scalability issues, particularly handling edge cases reliably. And then we've already talked about the regulatory concerns. But I think fundamentally, you need to consider, where do you need to be precise and deterministic, and consider guardrails, or actually replacing an LLM or an agent doing some reasoning with something that can reason causally or logically over a rules-based model. And where is it okay that actually we can have a bit of chaos and a bit of nuance and creativity in the output of content, and then use components together in a hybrid way to make sure that you're covering all those bases. But until then, human in the loop remains, absolutely critical.
Thanks, James, and yeah, completely agree. Thank you for sharing those thoughts. I'm conscious of time, so I think we should move on to the next segment on implementation strategies and some potential use cases both in the private and public sectors. So I think for, let's say, organizations looking to integrate agentic AI, I know we've touched on this some moments ago, but can you potentially share some advice to them? And are there some positive use cases where successful leveraging of agentic AI is happening? So James, I might go to you first, if that's okay.
Yeah, look, actually, because of time, I'll give a fairly short answer. I think successful attempts at agentic today are extremely domain specific, solving very well-defined problems in areas like software development, where you've really got a narrow scope, and they're constrained. They're operating within a very clear framework rather than actually attempting to deliver open-ended autonomy. As I said, lots and lots of POCs, lots and lots of running around and getting excited, but actually getting stuff into production requires a focus on that precision. And that is the hybrid approach. It is using knowledge graphs and deterministic causal models alongside LLMs. And again, as I said, that, you know, I've sometimes given this small example. It's pretty well understood. If you ask a large language model like ChatGPT, what's 1 + 1? It's going to tell you it's 2, not because it's calculated it, but because it's pretty well represented in its training data, i.e. the internet, that 1 + 1 = 2. If you give it a really complicated question, even in an agentic framework, you know, there's still no guarantee that what you're going to get is precision. But then why would you be asking it to do maths in the first place? There are ways of computing over knowledge, like regulation policy, that don't need an LLM to do the reasoning. They might need the LLM to get context and as part of an agentic process. But there are other forms of technology that stitch together. And again, I know I'm biased because that's been my almost 20 years of my life. But we need to start looking at AI as more than one thing, and is taking this hybrid approach, using things like knowledge graph, symbolic reasoning alongside LLM-based agents. And actually, if we put those together into an approach, we get to have our cake and eat it. But narrow, constrained, domain-specific is the answer, not trying to do things that are too generalized.
Thanks, James. Andrew, I'll go to you next.
So to keep that theme then, keeping it really simple, just to repeat some of what we've touched on, start with augmentation and evolve to autonomy over time as you build trust with the humans that you have in your organization that's starting to work with this technology. And over time, you'll build confidence and build capability and potentially shift more responsibility onto those systems. Strong governance and ethics we've talked about, and that interdisciplinary team, the hybrid approach of working with these systems. I wanted to kind of finish on an example that was put into the public domain last year from Toyota. And while it's a public sector sort of example, it carries over, because I know there's some public sector colleagues on the call, as a perfect example, something to look at now. So they built a system called Obeya, which is basically a system that has 9 agents inside of it. And each of those agents has been specialized in a particular domain knowledge. So again, it comes back to, we're looking at very verticalized domain specific opportunities of where we're applying it in the current day. And so they were trained on things like internal design documents, another agent on regulation, another agent on looking at handwritten notes. So when an engineer then comes to ask a question of the front end of that system, multiple agents will respond with their area of domain expertise, consolidating it all into one answer. Now, one of the biggest benefits this is already providing is helping to preserve and democratize expert knowledge within Toyota, particularly as workforce retire, the knowledge lives on through the software agents. And so when you think about maybe translating it into a public sector example, very similarly, there's institutional memory loss when people retire and move on, difficulty navigating large policy libraries. So when you're looking at any type of solution where you're trying to create a very specific area of expertise, these agents play a really good part when you bring them together as operators over specific sets of domain expertise. So whether it's environmental law, budget, history, or whatever it might be, it's all about augmenting those experts, and that's able to then yield much quicker, faster wins, better decisions, and innovation. So again, I know I've mentioned robots when we first kicked off the call, but it's not all about agents moving into the sort of physical domain and independent operators. They can still be very much virtual subject matter experts that are available to operate 24/7 to complement how your existing human workforce works.
Thank you, Andrew. Nell, I'll go to you next, if that's okay.
Yes. We've already started to see major issues with shadow AI, with AI being used in processes that it probably shouldn't, such as, for example, deciding who gets a visa application accepted, or indeed, perhaps, we've seen it applied to peer review of scientific papers and things like that. There are many things that we should not be using AI for, or at least if we are, that should be made explicit. And that's becoming more difficult in a world of agentic AI systems, which are able to go off and do things. It's incredibly important that we log who exactly did an action and the ultimate agency behind that. This is especially important in a world where a robot may be driven by AI, but it could also be an avatar, which is being driven by human beings. And quite often there's a switchover. For example, if a delivery robot gets stuck somewhere, often a remote overseer will connect to it to sort of help it on its way. And any changeover of the agency of that system needs to be made very explicit. This is especially the case now that agentic AI systems can call us on the phone, and it may be increasingly difficult to tell that we're actually dealing with a machine. This sort of epistemic clarity is going to be a major issue going forward.
Thank you, Nell. And yeah, shadow AI is an interesting term, which yeah, I've admittedly not really heard about. So keen to do my own research and learn a bit more about that. Sarwar, I'll go to you.
I'm going to focus on individuals and employees, especially those with who carry out non-technical roles like me, because ironically, you can actually put into a ChatGPT, how to sort of implement AI, agentic AI, effectively for your organizations, and all that stuff is available for free. So, in terms of the individual, in terms of my experience and my approach, I would say fundamentally, absolutely get curious. Figure out what AI can do, what it can't do. It's not going to solve everything, and it's not going to do your job for you necessarily, but by learning and understanding more about its capabilities, you can then figure out how it could be implemented into your work and your organization. I think the scale and pace of change currently can feel quite terrifying and similarly disempowering. You could sort of have a head in the sand type mentality and just assume it will just wash over and go away, but unlikely that's not going to be the case. I think it's here, it's happening. Businesses majority of workers have got AI in their workplace or using it in one form or another. So I think we have to engage and take that time. And by doing so, you'll empower yourself. You can work it out and then really understand how you want to utilize it to support your day-to-day. And lots of resources are out there, right? Many organizations, Salesforce included, we have online training resources made free of charge that folks can, employees, but also customers and non-Salesforce folks can sign up to and just understand and get trained up on certain modules around this technology and so on. So I very much encourage folks to take those points on board.
Thanks, Sarwar. We'll wrap up this segment and go to questions. I think that a number in the chat and conscious we have about 10 minutes left. So we'll take a few. One question regarding guardrails and controls. How easy is it to technically put in place controls and guardrails on these agents acting autonomously? So I'll open the floor to any panelists who want to tackle that question head on.
I'll have a crack at it. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? So if you think about a language model that's making some predictive output, whether this is just using an LLM on its own or in an agentic flow, you're ultimately allowing it to produce an answer that has the potential to be wrong, and then a guardrail is trying to then trap that against some kind of policy, rules, or regulatory framework. And there are various technologies that can do that. There's a big part of that's what we do at Rainbird. There's also an alternative where you can decide not to have an LLM act as a proxy for reasoning in the first place, but actually encode a domain model, a world model that knows just enough to be able to solve a particular aspect of a process. Let's say make a particular judgment. It could be determining whether or not you can afford a mortgage application. Just one small part of that. Build a model that represents that logic, and that may be encapsulated in regulation or policy, but turn that into something like a knowledge graph that you can reason over as an alternative to using a language model where you're trying to wrestle with the public training that wants to pull it into directions and hallucinate and to do other things. There's all sorts of different ways that you can tackle that challenge, but some of those are an allow all and then have to put some kind of guardrail on. Others are to replace that with a model that can reason in a way that is logical rather than probabilistic.
Fantastic. Any other comments on that question? Or
probably just a very brief addition. The other interesting side of it is actually the bias that we have when we actually input into the systems. So there's a lot of headlines around, oh, this AI model came up with this particular answer, but the way the question is phrased is causing the model to be very reflective of the language you're using, and therefore potentially provide a biased response in return. So we're not only just trying to control the sort of the responses from the systems from a hallucination point of view or from a topic point of view, we're also having to judge the quality of the inputs. And the technology and research is continuing to almost like the term called prompt expansion. So if the user provides a particularly short or inferior prompt, to expand it out to provide a richness of context that potentially kind of remove the bias before it even goes into the model. And the other side of it as well is we have to remember that sometimes these models can be used for very specific use cases that wouldn't otherwise be used in the general domain. You know, very specific in the security and police forces, certain topics, certain areas may mean that we do need these models to respond in a much more open way than with a different set of controls. So you'll find that the cloud platform, the hyperscalers, the vendors, they have a story around the controls that you'll have to control those inputs and outputs around the model to fit into your use case. But it comes back to testing in the case of your examples.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andrew. There's another question in the chat. The most efficient solution is not always our preferred response. For example, medical treatment and customer service. How can we manage technically embedding human values and preferences as part of the goal-oriented decision-making process? Any thoughts on that question?
It's going to be a tricky one. It's going to involve a sort of broad constitution, which helps the model to understand what is likely to be helpful and what is likely to be harmful in a given situation. But with that must also come personal context. You know, models must understand if somebody has an allergy or they have a particular dietary requirement or other sort of strong preference that needs to be accounted for, especially, of course, cultural issues. We want AI to be democratized and to help people around the world. It needs to be able to understand the values that people have and to act accordingly to those values while still also being reasonably universally humane. That's a very tricky balance to make, but it's something that we're all going to have to work towards together.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nell. I think there may be time for one more question. If anyone would like to come off mute and put a question to the panel, happy to take it. Okay, no worries. I think that there was one other question in the chat regarding, I guess, advice to public sector organizations looking to adopt AI. Obviously quite an interesting one and a few potential hurdles. Any comments or I guess any views on that?
I may jump in here just with a brief one. We recently published an AI playbook for public sector, so we go into detail there on specific measures, steps that public sector organizations can take to support their AI journey adoption. And that's something I would call out.
Yeah,
Thank
brilliant.
you. Similarly, I'd love to give a brief plug to saferagenticai.org, where I've been co-leading the development on a rubric for safer agentic AI, and hopefully that should provide some signposting for the things to pay most attention to.
Brilliant, thank you. And incidentally, that takes us to the end of that segment. Before the numbers do drop off, I do want to thank the panelists for what has been an insightful conversation. It's always a shame because it probably should have lasted a bit longer, but we're obviously keen to continue these activities going forward. Sorry, Andrew, do you have a point? Or
Sorry, wrong click.
Oh no, all good. So yeah, many thanks to Andrew from Microsoft, Nell Watson from the European Responsible AI Office, Sarwar from Salesforce, and James from Rainbird. I would flag into the chat that we will have more sessions on the horizon, including one on small language models, which will take place in April. And I would also flag techUK's AI Adoption Hub. Feel free to add the panelists on LinkedIn if you'd like. And on behalf of techUK, thank you to the panel and thank you for joining. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks all.